Like, what did they say? Like,
So, this is Nick, this is Soren, and that's me. And we're planning a trip to these 4 countries to meet Europe's refugees, the ones we hear about in the news.
The migrant crisis.
Syrian refugee
And what
crisis.
is Aleppo?
The little boy is in total
He was from
shock.
Kobani in
Symbol
Syria.
of an utter human catastrophe.
ISIS is right here on American soil.
Every
It's
generation
dangerous.
has had its own ugly reaction to refugees.
Last year, the world saw the number of displaced people at its highest ever, surpassing World War II levels. Migrants from Syria, other parts of the Middle East, and Northern Africa have been crossing land and sea to find safety and opportunity in Europe. Over the course of 8 weeks, we tried to look at this migration crisis from an American perspective. Why all this migration, and who are these people? We spoke with politicians, academics, and everyday citizens, and spent time in Europe's refugee camps, meeting people who were fleeing ISIS and trying to give their children a future. I want to show you why you might pay your life savings for a chance at living, because I think you would do it too. Migration is and always has been a hot topic.
We have a dysfunctional immigration system.
Today, our immigration system is broken.
Politicians point to immigration as the source of lots of issues.
The impact on schools, wage compression, accident and emergency crisis in our hospitals.
It's an effective tactic for 2 reasons. One, some voters do feel a negative short-term impact from immigration.
So they feel that there is a competition.
That's Dr. Renee McAuliffe, a professor who studies immigration at Pontifical Gregorian University in Rome. He's talking about voters who feel the effects of immigration.
It's tough, especially people who have a number of social problems in their neighborhoods which are not being properly dealt with.
In other words, immigration intensifies already present social inequalities. For many of these people, open borders means less public funds for social services they use, and more public funds for assimilation, housing, and health services for immigrants. But more importantly, there are also fears about the changing face of a nation, cultural identity. One study looked at compositional concerns. That's being worried about if an immigrant is a good fit in the community. The study found that worries about social, cultural, and linguistic cohesion mattered 3 to 5 times more than concerns about wages and taxes.
Migrants, the majority of the migrants, belong to another religion. They have different language, different customs. My advice is that fear of the unknown is not a good advisor. And I believe that in the case that the United States receive populations from Syria, from Iraq, etc., it will not affect the whole status of the country.
So many politicians draw on these fears and oversimplify complex systemic issues. They tell voters there's this one group of people to blame for increases in crime and terrorism. The trick is, these politicians offer to fix it all with a deliverable promise.
We are going to build a great border wall.
If there's one thing the national government can definitely control, it's national borders. Leaders can't always legislate the movement of free markets or shape social sentiment, but they can definitely determine who can enter the country.
There are immigration laws, and they tend to operate like tabs.
That's Joost van Loon, a sociology professor in Germany.
If you need more people, you open them. Your filter becomes a bit less strict, and then you don't need to close it. That's an economic principle that's being done, and it's a legal principle. The only problem is when you're confronted with refugees seeking immediate refuge.
And that's what's happening right now in Europe. Record numbers of people are seeking refuge, but many of them are dying in the Mediterranean. Let's find out why. Check out this weighted map of the richest countries in the world. Land area is exaggerated here based on GDP, so you can distinctly see the US and Europe. But in this cartogram, birth rates are weighted, and Africa and the Middle East bulge under the pressure of a young, populous generation. A generation in search of better opportunities.
when we look at the enormous structural differences between the areas surrounding Europe and Europe, they will try to migrate. And this tendency, I think, will increase.
Could these people of many nations become a part of the European way of life?
So there are basically two types of migration, forced and voluntary. And for the most part, everything we've mentioned falls under economic migrants. Much of history deals with migration for a better life. But even that term falls in this strange gray area between forced and voluntary migration. Doesn't just about everyone migrate to improve their standard of living?
So we make a stupid distinction between economic and non-economic refugees, right? So what do you do with a country torn by a war where there is no food? Are you then fleeing for economic or non-economic purposes?
Let's talk about forced migrants though. IDPs, asylum seekers, refugees. You might have heard these terms, and recently we've also seen more migrants affected by a changing climate. The best way to understand these terms is on a timeline. Let's imagine it's 2013 and you're living in Damascus, a major city in Syria. Syria's a beautiful country with a relatively high standard of living. Yes, that's actually a video made by the Syrian Tourism Ministry. In December 2013, the civil war finally reaches your neighborhood. You're a victim of extreme violence, and you have a well-founded fear of being further impacted by the war. You have to flee your home. That would make you one of 6.6 million Syrians who move somewhere else in the country to escape the violence. That's just as many people as living in Chicago and LA combined. You're now an IDP, an internally displaced person. There are more than 37 million of these worldwide, and they're the most at risk of becoming refugees. You don't become a refugee until you cross an international border into a second country like Turkey. At that point, you're protected by international law. In second countries like Turkey and Lebanon, refugee camps can be huge, so much that entire generations grow up and live in these camps. So you have a choice. You can stay there and face limited access to education, employment, and movement, or you can try to enter into Europe. Resettlement is this other avenue, and that might get you into the US, a third country. But it's not really an option for you unless you get flagged by the UN Refugee Service. They choose strong candidates for being severely disabled or vulnerable. Countries can also be very selective about this process and bring in only the wealthiest or most educated. And if you're going to the US, you'd also have to go through all of this. On top of that, it would take 18 months or more staying in the same camp before you fly anywhere. Less than 1% of refugees worldwide are resettled. So you're still in Turkey, and your passport likely won't let you just fly into London or Berlin because you come from an EU-determined dangerous country. They require visa approval in advance, which is not going to happen. You could travel by land up to the Bulgarian border, but actually they just built a wall there in 2015. Your only other option for seeking asylum is to head to the coast and give a smuggler $2,000 per person and board an overcrowded boat to cross the Mediterranean, taking one of these routes and hoping the EU Border Authority will rescue your craft and bring you to Greece to seek asylum. That's the happy version of the story. All too often, boats are overcrowded. People are taken advantage of. They develop symptoms of PTSD after losing a family member in the water. It doesn't seem worth it. But the crazy thing is, it actually is worth it. Because what's your alternative? Most Syrians affected by the civil war in Syria are in Syria. In the next video, we're going to meet some people who have been through journeys much scarier than this, but I think you'll be amazed just how positive they still are.